Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's event, How to Turn KYB and KYC into Your Competitive Advantage. I'm Zoe Gold. I'm today's moderator. I'm also a customer success manager at Persona. I'm currently freezing in San Francisco. Just to get the audience engaged a little bit, if you could go ahead and comment in the chat where you are. I will pull it up and see if we get some comments. No one yet. But anyways, I'm sure we're all over the place. Thank you so much for being here today. So before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of maintenance items or housekeeping. So if you have questions about the content or technical questions, anything like that, please go ahead and ask those in the chat. We'll answer those throughout today's presentation as well as at the end. This session is being recorded and it will be available on demand after the event. So you'll get a recording to your inbox. If you ever want to repeat or re-listen to any of the information that you're receiving, you can feel free to do that. And lastly, finally, we have a 3-question survey that will pop up in the browser window, in your browser window after we conclude today's online event. So please help us help you by taking the survey. We want to know what you thought of today's event, and let us know. So again, I'm Zoe. I'm joined by Neil and Laura today. I'll let them introduce themselves. So Laura, why don't you get us started?
Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Laura. I lead our solutions engineering team here at Persona. I am also in San Francisco and I come from Brazil. What else should I say? My background is in fraud and IDV, and I'm very excited to chat with you all about KYB today. Neil?
Hey everyone, my name is Neil and I'm on the product team here at Persona. I've been leading our KYB solution, so I'm excited to share that all with you today.
Awesome. Thanks both. Excited to have everyone here today and to get into some good discussion. So today's agenda, we're going to go ahead and go over, Laura's going to present KYB. What is KYB? Who is it relevant to and why? We'll get into a little discussion between the three of us and try and get some, questions answered that we've seen frequently asked. Neil will go ahead and talk about how to build a KYB process. And with the remaining time, we'll cover off on the questions that folks are asking throughout. So again, please stay engaged. Please ask us questions. We will do our best to get to them all as much as we can. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Laura, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Zoe. All right, everyone, let's start by chatting a little bit about what KYB is. So very simply, KYB is this need for businesses to know who they are engaging with. And so from a business perspective, that could be company partners or service providers, and also the individuals who are behind those companies. So there's 3 core questions that we're going to ask ourselves. The first one is this business that I'm engaging with legitimate? Is it real? Second one is, who are the individuals behind the business and can I validate this relationship? And then the last one is, are those individuals who they say they are? And that's where we see KYB and KYC really merging. Next slide, we're going to start talking about why KYB is important. And we're going to touch on 3 specific things. First one is compliance. Second one is fraud prevention. And then the last one is trust and safety. And in this coming slide, we're going to start chatting about compliance. Compliance matters very simply because we just need to follow the rules. We don't really have a choice in that matter, but then we start thinking about what are those rules? And the core thing there is that it kind of varies, really. So it depends on what region you're in. It depends on what requirements your banking partner is providing. There's no kind of single source of truth or a single regulation that's dictating KYB for every country in the world. But as we think about the different regulations, there are a couple of common threads that we can highlight. First, one of which is this idea of ensuring suitable due diligence. And what that means is essentially understanding who the beneficial owners are. When you think about that, really the question you're asking yourself is, who's benefiting from this transaction, right? I'm interacting with a business, but who's behind and who could benefit? And it's up to you to figure out and to validate both the company and those individuals. Second thing, pretty straightforward, but it's in essence not doing business with any individual or company that has been associated with criminal activity. And there's 2 things we're going to look at to validate this. First one is sanctioned countries. We shouldn't be doing business with sanctioned countries. And then the second one is global watch lists and sanctions. That's true for both the companies and the individuals that we're going to be working with. So really the bottom line is we need to understand the regulatory needs from our banking partners, as well as the location in which we're operating in order to make sure that our KYB solution is compliant. But before we move over to fraud prevention, there's one more thing that I'm going to touch on. And that is essentially that if we look at the last few years, you can see KYB regulation evolving. There's two regulations that I'm going to bring up here that I think highlight this point. First one is EU's AML directive, and the second one is the US's CDD rule under the Bank Secrecy Act. Those two regulations in 2017 and 2016 respectively is when they actually started addressing AML blind spots and really including regulation that speaks to KYB. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because that helps us frame and kind of start understanding the broader KYB landscape and the fact that these regulations are continually evolving and still being interpreted. And so there is some confusion and differentiation in the types of solutions and how folks are looking to address it. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because you need a solution that's flexible enough that's going to help us not just address what we have now, but all of the new iterations that are going to be coming up. We're going to talk a little bit about fraud prevention now. And to start, let's touch on why fraud prevention matters. So fraud prevention matters essentially because we're scared that bad companies, bad individuals are going to come and do bad things in our platform. So our core thing here is we need to validate that the business are legitimate, and we need to validate that the individuals aren't here to commit fraud and do bad things. So those would be money laundering or, using shell companies or like this little guy on the screen, just taking your money and leaving with it. But what I want us to focus on is what's happened in recent years. So in recent years, there has been an increase in the digitalization of payments and financial technology in general. So we see a lot more cryptocurrency companies and digitalization of lending, e-wallets, online banking. All of that is to say that there's all these new vectors of fraud that we need to be looking at and trying to address. That has also increased the prevalence of fake companies and money laundering in general. And so the important thing with fraud, though, is that it's not just about that validation, right? Fraud is multifaceted. And so we need to be looking at what could indicate fishy behavior that's not necessarily just the validation that you're doing. So very simply could be something like, how many businesses are signing up from a single IP address or from the same device fingerprint? And why would they be signing up from the same device fingerprint if they're not, related in any way, shape, or form? So we need to, as we think about fraud, we need to be merging these harder signals like the verifications with softer signals like the information that we're just collecting about anybody who's interacting with our platform, and then creating a holistic solution. That allows us to even do some basic level kind of segmentation of the companies that are coming to work with us into low risk, medium risk, high risk, and then we can provide them specific experiences and higher levels of validation based on the risk that we're assessing there. Last thing we're going to touch on is trust and safety. And trust and safety matters essentially because we want to make sure that we can trust the individuals and companies in our platform, and they want to make sure that they can trust us. So the core question here is really, how do we actually encourage that trust? And so 3 things I'm going to touch on, they kind of relate to each other. First thing is the initial interaction is very critical. And that is essentially the initial PII collection. So as businesses come to work with you, you need to do some validation. The first thing you're going to do is collect information about that business and the individuals. But that's PII, right? And so you need to make sure that that collection flow is safe and secure and instills trust in those individuals. Kind of related to the point, to this point, is this idea of white labeling and making sure that the experience in your platform is cohesive. And so this may seem like an afterthought, but it's quite critical to make sure that as you're providing this KYB validation, you are ensuring that the branding of anything that you're using to collect is aligned with your business in order to create an experience that doesn't seem jarring to the end user. And then the last bit here, it's kind of a mindset shift that I'm asking folks to potentially consider. And when we think about fraud prevention and verification, we're really usually thinking about additional friction. What I want us to think about, though, when it comes to trust and safety is reframing that and thinking of it as like a signal to the companies and the individuals that you care about who's onboarding into your platform. And so you are validating them, and therefore they should know that anybody that's interacting with this service has been validated, and you're putting in the effort to create trust and foster it in your platform. All right, so last thing we're going to talk about is who should actually care about KYB. And the way in which we're going to frame this in the next slide is two buckets. So the way we're thinking about it to make it easier to categorize is regulated and unregulated industries. So in the next slide, you'll see this chart that contains two buckets. The first one is regulated. Those are the industries that we hear talking about KYB the most, right? It's the fintechs, it's the cryptos, gambling. So those are industries that just need to comply with KYB regulation. The other bucket that we have here is unregulated industries. And so those are folks that tend to focus more on trust and safety and fraud prevention as reasons why they may be deciding to do additional due diligence and validation on the business. One thing that I do want to note is that we've been seeing kind of a merger of the two as companies expand their offerings and they start looking for new use cases. And so maybe you start on an unregulated industry, but the core thing to know here is think about the use case, not just the broader industry in which you operate, because even though you may be generally an unregulated industry, you may be releasing a new product feature or a use case that actually is regulated. And so it's important to really look holistically at why we're doing KYB. I'm going to touch on one last thing before I pass on over to Zoe for the discussion, and that's just to kind of put it all together, what we've talked about so far, and give us a couple of use cases to base ourselves off of. In this upcoming slide, you're going to see 3 customer use cases, and those are just a couple of examples of folks that we've been working with to help them address KYB in different ways. First one is the car manufacturing. I want to bring this up because I think it's a good example of a mostly unregulated industry that has decided to do KYB for fraud and trust and safety purposes. First use case there is companies that are coming to them to purchase fleet vehicles. So that's obviously a large sum purchase, and they need to do due diligence to make sure that those companies are legitimate and they're not going to be defrauded. Second one is this idea of preferred service providers. And so they have a list. Let's say I go in and I buy my own vehicle and then I lose my wheel for whatever reason, you know, in San Francisco, sometimes that stuff happens. And so now I need a new wheel. And I go to that website and I'm trying to figure out where can I find this? And so if I see a list of service providers, I have to trust that company that they did due diligence. And then I can then legitimately go to one of these businesses and get a new wheel. And so that's really the trust and safety angle. And shifting over to the next 2 examples, this is the most common use case that we see really, and it's compliance, trust and safety, fraud, all combined for the most part. And then it's just a matter of which is the core thing that we're doing to address KYB here, and what are the other items that also play a part. First one is card issuing fintech. They need to verify legitimacy of self-incorporated businesses. The point to highlight here is that it can be hard to verify self-incorporated businesses, right? If you're not doing it on an automated way and you're collecting that information, it's usually like a single individual potentially who is leading the business and having to do KYB. You don't want to give them a terrible experience as they're trying to validate themselves. And then the last one here is an NFT marketplace. And the example here is just to say that all kinds of fintech companies really need to care about KYB and the validation of the businesses that they're interacting with. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful to kind of help shape the conversation we're going to have. So I'm going to pass it over to Zoe for the discussion piece.
I think it was more than helpful. I think you gave us a pretty good foundation to work off of from here. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that will kind of guide us towards thinking through what a process actually looks like, what are the challenges, and so forth. Again, just as a reminder, we're going to have this discussion now. We're going to get to the Q&A section after this. It is in the Q&A part of the Zoom, not the chat. I just received a message about that. So please post them in the Q&A, not the chat. Thank you. So Neil, let's dive right into the discussion. I'm going to start by asking you a question. When we're talking about KYB and all of the stuff Laura just set us up with, what are we actually checking? What needs to be checked?
Yeah, that's a great question, Zoe. As Laura mentioned earlier, this really varies country to country based on regulatory requirements. But ultimately, there's a lot of commonalities across different jurisdictions. So first is verifying the business's identity. This can include the business address, business registration number, business name. Second would be identifying and verifying the business's directors and or their ultimate beneficial owners. You also as well want to collect and verify business registration documents. And then finally, you want to maintain updated customer information and monitor risk on an ongoing basis. So a good example of this would be ongoing watch list screening against the business, not just checking that the business is on a watch list at the point of onboarding, but over the entire life cycle of that business operating on your platform, checking against these watch lists.
One of the points you just mentioned was about identifying the business's identity. And one thing that I'm aware of, having worked in the space for a while, is that there are all different types of businesses, right? You could be incorporated, you could be a sole proprietorship. When you're talking about the business identity, does it look different based on what type of business you are trying to verify?
Absolutely. So as Laura touched upon as well, there's certain types of businesses such as LLCs or C corporations, but then there's also a huge bucket, which are sole proprietorships. And for the sole props, you need to make sure that you're kind of falling back to doing additional types of checks on those businesses. So you may not have information available through authoritative data sources. So you really want to verify the legitimacy of that individual so that you know who they are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other piece that I was interested in hearing more about was about the ultimate beneficial owner, right? I know that can be a challenge, at least in the US, to understand who owns what. So can you talk through what you've seen before for how businesses solve for this problem? How do people know who the beneficial owner is?
Yeah, definitely. So beneficial owner requirements really vary country to country. And in the US, it's very much self-reported. So the CDD final rule really requires firms to, what they call it, verify beneficial ownership with a reasonable belief. And so that requires, companies to be able to collect this information from the individuals that are onboarding on behalf of companies. And some of the things that they do are, requiring a document. So if you're inputting all the beneficial owners for a given business, you also would likely want to require them to submit a document that lists out the beneficial ownership for each person and the amount of equity that they own in that given company.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Neil. Okay, I'm just jumping off of everything that we've kind of put together. Let's move into the next question, Laura, directed at you. When we talk about the process of KYB, what's the usual process that you've seen? And I think closely coupled with this is obviously the common challenges. So if you could talk through that a little bit, it'd be great.
Yeah, great question. So I would say there's not necessarily like one single common solution that we've seen. That touches on what I talked about before, which is different interpretations. Folks have different solutions. And so maybe I'll start by saying some of the common things that we've seen. If we focus first on information collection, honestly, we've seen everything from applications that have forms built out that they use for information collection to Google Forms that are sent out to businesses, and even just long PDFs that collect the information and go back and forth via email. So that should start highlighting some of the problems we're going to touch on. We've also seen kind of a disjointed process and a lot of manual intervention. A lot of the times customers will come to us and maybe they just want a KYB solution, right? And they already have a different provider for KYC. So usually what they'll do is they use that provider to validate the beneficial owners. And what they're looking for is a provider to do the KYB assessment. And so you can start to see how they may be using multiple providers to do one single thing, which is validate this business that you're working with. And that creates a lot of kind of breaks in the process and the ability to potentially have, operational inefficiencies as well as data inconsistencies. I'm going to talk about that a little more in depth, but I think the core challenges are, how are they collecting that information? Are they requiring the individuals to go back and forth? So if I'm a business owner and I'm trying to validate my business, how many times am I actually interacting with this company in order to prove that, in fact, I am a legitimate business and I am, one of the beneficial owners, or maybe I'm just the authorized representative and the beneficial owners are then validating themselves. So let me summarize the problems that we've been seeing with the approach. First one is combining multiple vendors, but not really necessarily having a way to architect everything. So again, that speaks to the operational inefficiency that we've been seeing. Second one is ops teams are having to collect data across multiple vendors. That creates the necessity to then be working with different vendors to do the configuration. Two, potentially some data inconsistency depending on how they are actually like plug and playing all of the information in the process. And then three, obviously when you introduce a lot of manual breaks in the process, bias can be introduced. And so when the information collection itself before the final assessment is manual in nature, there's a lot of potential room for error there. And then the last thing that we need to think about is really like, what is the impact on the end user that's trying to validate their business? And that's usually what we're seeing is long wait times for that process to be completed.
Yeah, it's interesting because what I'm hearing really is like, there isn't necessarily a typical approach or a standard process. It's more like, what do you have set up to begin with, whether it's for KYC or any sort of process for KYB? And then how do you ensure that that actually integrates with a streamlined user experience? One thing that I was thinking of while you were talking about the user experience is also, if you're a user who's waiting a week to hear back about, verifying your business, you may write in a couple of times to that support team that you're waiting on from, right? So also, not only is the user experience impacted, but I could also see some adverse response or whatever you might call it to the business itself that's doing the verifying, in that their support tickets might be increasing, the time spent on the manual review process might be increasing, even if it's already quite long because of this back and forth. Yeah. So it's interesting how the problem kind of seems to compound on itself. Okay, so we have the foundations of what needs to be checked. We have a general understanding of the usual challenges that come up and that maybe there isn't a standard process. So Neil, when you're building a process, what should you be considering? Where do you start?
That's a great question. This is not an exhaustive list, but some key things to consider would be, let's say first, conversion. You want to make sure that the time between the business submitting their information and them being approved is as short as possible. And that really requires ensuring a great customer experience where you're reducing the amount of back and forth between your operations team, your compliance team, and the business itself. And this really touched upon what you just mentioned, Zoe, and as well, Laura, on if you're having to have a user write in multiple times to check on the status of whether or not they've been approved to use as a given platform, that can really hurt your conversion for your platform. The second would be fraud. So, how do you check that an individual isn't impersonating to be a part of a business? And how do you catch businesses that are bad actors? And as well, checking that there are no bad actor individuals associated with the business itself. Next would be compliance, ensuring that you're doing suitable due diligence to meet the regulatory requirements of the different countries that you're operating in. And then to that end, I would say coverage as well is really important, right? So does the vendor provide the coverage from a data perspective that allows you to be compliant in all of these different countries that you're operating in? And then finally, streamlining operations. So, to what Laura mentioned as one of the key challenges, that's definitely something to consider if you need to have your team pulling in information from multiple different vendors and putting it into one central place. You really want to make it as easy as possible for them to do that so that they have better and greater operational efficiency if and when they do need to review specific cases of businesses onboarding.
I'm smirking to myself because as you were saying this, you said 4 words that started with C, and then I made up the 5th one. So I feel like it can kind of be the 5 C's. You said conversion, catching fraudsters, coverage, and compliance, right? And then your final one was streamlining operations. So that maybe could be consistency. right?
I
So we
love it. That's perfect.
creative. There's the sixth C. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. I think the interesting piece about streamlining operations, just given the fact that I'm from an analyst background, is that consistency piece, right? So not only could you have a really inefficient process, but you could also have different folks based on their experience providing different results, and that can get really convoluted and confusing for an audit purpose, whatever it is. Okay, so we have a lot of information from this discussion. Neil just gave us some tips on those 5 C's where to start, but I'm kind of curious, and maybe Laura, you can speak to this, like, how do you build a process that gets you to your ideal state?
Yes. So that's essentially what my team is doing with all of our customers, right? Like figuring out how do we understand what you need and then help you build that process. So really the way that we're going to put it all together is consider all the things that Neil just touched on. And our question to customers is really, what is your current state? And so the first thing that we do is understand, how are you prioritizing between compliance, fraud, and trust and safety, all obviously while keeping in mind conversion? That just goes without saying. Really, our focus is making sure that that experience is great for the business and the end user, as well as operationally. But how are you prioritizing these 3 is going to give us the first signal that we need to start building it. And that's where later on in the process, if you have to make trade-offs, you're going to be able to make trade-offs against the priority list that you have. So that's really unpacking the business needs. Then we start solutioning. We start figuring out what are your compliance needs, if you have any. So what is your banking partner telling you? What are the regulations that you're abiding by? What is necessary to do that validation? And then as we start figuring out how to plug and play, like, do you have other providers? So as you think about, even as we think about what vendor we are going to go with, you have to consider that first of all, right? What do I currently have? Do I need an all-in-one solution? Do I need a flexible solution? Do I need some kind of hybrid between the two, depending on what part of the process I'm looking at? And from there, we start building. Once we have a solution that we feel good about, then we have to start looking at analytics, right? So continual, transparent tracking, so we can understand the metrics that are associated with the solution that we built. And so that allows us to kind of iterate on whatever we built and continue to change, especially as that visibility is so critical, because as we learn more about the businesses that are onboarding and the propensity for fraud, even, we can then make adjustments.
Okay, let's capitalize on the last thing you just said. You were talking a little bit about analytics. So when you're thinking about metrics around KYB, what metrics matter?
Yeah, great question. At the risk of sounding repetitive, I will say that it really varies. Again, it's based on what the initial business needs and the priorities are. But at a very high level, we're looking at things like, how long is it taking for the individual to finalize the verification, right? So time to completion of that entire process, off each segment of the process, and that allows us to do additional streamlining. We're also considering automated decisions versus manual decision. If there is kind of a need to do end-to-end manual review, then what we're looking at is operational efficiency. So as analysts come in and resolve cases, we're looking at how long is it taking? Are they going back and forth? Is there additional information that's required that we should be streamlining upfront based on certain scenarios, right? And then as we look holistically at that manual review, we're then looking at opportunities for automation. So we're tracking things like the number of failures that we're getting, the number of successes that we're getting, and we're breaking it down based on the business verification as well as the individual verifications. And again, making adjustments as needed. We're also looking at things like, how well is the process performing? So when you have manual validation, what you can then do is compare what the automation said with what the manual review said. And so we're doing that to get a sense for accuracy. Are we catching the things? Are we failing the things that we should be failing? And of the things that we're failing, what percentage should we actually be failing, right? So those are 2 core metrics. We call them precision. And we're looking at it holistically to have a baseline understanding of how efficient this process is and how well are we doing it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that last piece, it's like, are we catching what we should be catching, actually really ties into the broader theme that I'll try and like summarize a little bit about what you were just saying about getting to your ideal state, which is that it sounds like your first step is to know what your actual goal is here. what matters to your business. And that can actually tie really closely in then to the metrics that you're tracking and the analytics that matter to you too. So although it might seem redundant, you saying it varies makes sense because the goals of the different organizations are going to vary for their process. So makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, want to wrap up the discussion a little bit, but I also want to give Neil and Laura one more opportunity to just like mention anything else that they were hoping to caveat, tips, anything like that. Neil, you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, regulation is constantly evolving. So you want to be able to easily and flexibly adapt your KYB process, whether that's something that you're building completely in-house or leveraging multiple vendors. You want to make sure that it can be adapted to the evolving, regulatory landscape.
Honestly, I'm just going to plus one that and then add one more thing, which is I think we underestimate the need for providing an experience that's streamlined upfront, right? The entry point is the place at which you're saying, hey, here's what this process is going to look like for you. And it's a huge point of conversion drop that we see for individuals. And so thinking about how can you make sure that you're providing the best possible experience from the moment that they start interacting with your KYB process is critical and shouldn't be underestimated if you're really caring about conversion and making sure those individuals get through the flow.
Okay, so we've really driven home the point then of flexibility and being able to adapt to what you're seeing in your user base, essentially, and regulations potentially. Okay, great. So great discussion. Thanks, team. Let's move on. Neil's going to chat through what the market has looked like so far, and then also where the market is heading with respect to solutions for the KYB process. So Neil, I'll let you take it away.
Perfect. So for many years, really, building a KYB process was extremely difficult and oftentimes really, really manual. So in the next slide, what we're going to showcase is it requires a company to collect a lot of information on the business. So let's start on the top half. First, a business has to collect information from their end user who's representing a business. So that includes the business name, the business address, the business EIN. We're talking about the US, but then globally, this could be a business registration number. Then an individual may have to run business verifications against those three pieces of info. And they could choose to do that manually. We've heard many customers actually using Google or like manually inputting these pieces of information into different platforms. But once they run these business verifications, the team actually has to manually review all of this information. So bringing together all of these different outputs from these different services and deciding, do we want to approve this business or decline this business based on the information that we've gathered? But this is only one half of the equation. So if we go to the bottom half, you'll see that this is highlighting the aspect of collecting information on each of the beneficial owners. This could also be any of the directors associated with the business. And in this case, you have to collect the individual info for each person. You have to run KYC checks, so oftentimes requiring leveraging another vendor or building another process in-house. And then you have to manually review all of this information. And then you come to a decision. And so once you have the decision on the top half regarding the business, a decision on the bottom half regarding any of the directors or the beneficial owners, you have to make a final decision combining both of these pieces of information together. And so what we've seen is that this can be really, really cumbersome because companies oftentimes have to even stitch together multiple different vendors to make this final decision on whether or not to approve a business and the individuals that are associated with that business. So given these pain points that we've seen from customers, the next slide is really our take on KYB and where we think the industry is headed in the future. So what you'll notice here on this next slide is the ability for Persona to be able to collect the business information and run the business verifications automatically. So rather than having to stitch together multiple vendors and then combine this all together, you can use Persona to manage the entire lifecycle. So collecting business info, running the business verifications automatically, collecting information on each of the individuals, and then running the KYC checks in a really streamlined way. And what we've seen is, this saves customers a tremendous amount of time in being able to design and implement a KYB process so that they can ultimately onboard and approve businesses to use their service. And while many customers of ours, choose to use the end-to-end solution that we have and use all the pieces, some choose to use data sources, as you'll see on the next slide, where they're plugging in their own vendors or their new or any data sources that they have on their end. And we find that customers really like this flexibility because some of them may already have an existing contract with the data provider they want to use. And so rather than locking in a company to use just Persona data sources, we want to provide that interoperability to allow companies to be able to plug and play the different data sources they have, which I know is a super important consideration as you're designing your KYB and KYC process. What did I show off today? With Persona, you have an end-to-end streamlined solution that allows you to stitch together running different business verifications, running different document verifications, running KYC checks in one place. And for any of the checks that I showed, you can substitute those out if you want to use your own provider. So with the business watch list screening, you could choose to plug in your own watch list screening vendor or your own business adverse media vendor, or even your own KYC provider if you really would like to do that. But really, we have a flow that's optimizing for conversion by streamlining that process and then bringing together multiple disparate pieces of information together into one single view so that you can ultimately make an automatic decision on whether to approve or decline the business. With that, I'll pass it back to Zoe and we'll kind of move forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Neil. That was a really great demo. I'm just going to click through some of these slides here. So we've moved on. We're going to move on to the Q&A portion of our event. So reminder, you can ask these questions through the Q&A feature, not the chat. If we don't get to your question, I just want to note it's because we have quite a few of them. So we'll follow up via email after the event. We're going to try and prioritize questions based on how often we're getting the same one and so forth. So I'll start, Laura, by asking you a question from the audience. So an audience member asked the following: the data collected needs to adhere to record retention. Is that correct? Will you speak to that, Laura?
Yes, that's definitely correct. The details really depend on bank and jurisdiction, but TLDR is definitely need to adhere to record retention rules and then be retrievable as well.
Okay. And then Laura or Neil, can one of you guesstimate how long the vetting process takes from a vendor management standpoint? How off the shelf is this service really?
Want to take it, Neil?
Yeah, definitely. Having been involved in quite a few of these calls with prospective customers, we've seen it be extremely fast because for a lot of them, what they would otherwise have to do is go to multiple different vendors to actually build a KYB solution themselves. And so rather than having to go through the vendor management process and filling out security questionnaires, doing the security due diligence, and really expanding their vendor surface area, this allows them to kind of run that due diligence on both aspects, both the KYB and the KYC. And so it's really made customers feel much more comfortable with kind of going with this all-in-one solution because it reduces the time that they can get to market in actually leveraging the solution behind the scenes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Do you mind if I add one thing?
Please.
One other aspect of it that is very close to my heart, since that is what my team deals with, is the implementation. And so one thing to note is that, yeah, that solution that you saw is built, you could implement it as easily as just adding a link into your platform, right? So depending on the types of implementation that you want, we've seen folks implement with this solution in as little as like a day or two. And obviously, if you want to make it native to your experience, then it may take a week or 2 weeks to actually complete that, as long as you have dedicated resources. But I do think it is another important point to note, the implementation time.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I'm just looking at our next question here. Thanks for bearing with me. Ooh, I like this one. Neil, maybe you want to start kicking us off with this. How does KYC differ from KYB?
Yeah, there is a lot in common in terms of the types of things that you need to check. So the regulation is coming from the same central authority, in this case, FinCEN. But as Laura kind of mentioned earlier in the call, KYB regulations have been a bit behind KYC. And so there's a lot that's happening in terms of different governments and authorities trying to catch up. So for example, in the US, there's new regulation that's coming out about potentially creating a central database for beneficial ownership information as other countries have it. And so we're starting to see some ways in which the KYB process and the requirements are catching up to kind of the same level of specificity that you see on the KYC side. But Laura, if you have anything to add, please jump in as well.
No, I echo that. I would almost say that it's like it's not like necessarily how they differ, it's more how they interact. I mean, it was apparent from our process, but me and you, we just went through a KYC process that was part of the bigger KYB process, right? And I think what we touched on earlier is when you are validating a business, there's somebody behind that business, and that's the person that's going to benefit from any interaction, right? Why we call it beneficial owners. And so I would say it's almost more like how they interact as opposed to how they differ.
Yeah. The way that I answered this question, not that we were asking me, but the way that I answer this question when I get it from a customer is I think about it kind of hierarchically, right? Like KYC it's embedded within KYB. So it's again, not that they're different. It's that one is kind of a piece of the other. Okay. We have one more question. I think we're gonna get through two more questions. So Neil, what are the required fields for a business to submit?
It really depends on the types of verifications that you want to run. So with what I showed in the demo, the bare minimum that's required is the business name, the business tax ID, and the business address. And so that's what we see many customers leveraging. Some choose maybe to not use that business tax ID, but in which case you also would not be able to run that TIN verification, where you're taking the business name, you're taking the tax ID, and you're checking directly with the IRS. But those are really the three minimum required pieces of information.
Got it. Okay, makes sense to me. And I'm going to take another question from the audience. Laura, this one's for you. The question was, are the statuses of each of the items that are reviewed something that can be made available to another system? So if our primary system can alert staff on what's happening or share that status with customers, for example.
Great question. Definitely is the TLDR. So I'm going to touch on the technical side and then less technical side, but our system has many ways to notify other systems of what's happening. Yes, we are collecting and aggregating all that information, but let's say you have an entire case management system that's already built out. And what you want is when we finalize the aggregation of information, you want to extract everything and plug it onto that system that already exists. You can definitely do that. So everything is available via webhooks and API. You can extract all that data, plug it somewhere else. The other option would be to receive like email notifications, or maybe it's even a text message, a Slack notification. We have all sorts of built-in features that allow us to notify different systems of where a process of validation is at. And so let's say you wanted to, once the business validation is done, but we're still waiting on the beneficial owners to finalize that process, you want a notification to be able to notify the authorized representative, hey, we've done this piece, you're good to go there, we're just waiting on your business, on your beneficial owners. You can do that as well. So many different ways, but TLDR is, yes, you can retrieve whatever data you want from that system and make it work with anything that you already have in-house.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. I know we have several more questions in the Q&A part, but we're nearing the end of this event. So I just wanted to, first of all, say thank you for joining us. Second of all, reiterate that we will follow up with the questions that did not get answered. If you're interested in learning more about Persona Solution or getting a custom demo, we're dropping a link into the chat. So please go ahead and fill out that form, and our team will be in touch with you if you do fill it out. I just wanted to say one more time, thanks again for joining us today. Reiterating those maintenance items from the beginning, we'll be sending a recording of today's event via email to your inbox. Additionally, as soon as this event ends, we have a 3-question survey that will pop up in the browser window. Please help us help you by taking the survey. We really want to know how we did today and what was valuable or maybe what wasn't. If you want, again, to see that customized demo or dive more into the features of KYB, please let your customer success manager know if you're already working with us, or let us know through that demo request form that we've dropped into the chat. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.